And we could read the other passages that I note here, but for sake of time, the messages are very similar. What do you note in those passages? And those are prophecies about different things. There's a prophecy about Jesus, and a prophecy about the coming of the law, and a prophecy about Christ's ministry, and all the things we just read. What's the consistent thread in all those passages? Anybody note anything? There is a brighter future. It's open to all. I agree with both of those. If you note all of those passages, they all note that these important future brighter events occur or are centered in Jerusalem. Now, a caveat, you always got to be careful with that, because prophets sometimes will use spiritual Jerusalem or spiritual Israel, and so you have to be careful. But there are times in Old Testament prophecy where it's pretty clear that we're talking about the dirt of Israel. We're talking about physical Israel. When it mentions specifically Bethlehem, where a future leader will come out, when it mentions specifically Zebulun will be the future leader, a light will be in the land of Zebulun, which would have been northern Israel. When it mentions specifically that the law of the Lord will come forth from Jerusalem and from Mount Zion, all of these bright events of the future very clearly are from biblical prophecy supposed to happen in Jerusalem. So as we sit in 538 BC, what's the problem with that? There ain't no Jews in Jerusalem. Well, that's a problem. So we got all of these significant events that have been prophesied that are going to happen in Jerusalem. That our Savior is going to be born in Bethlehem of Judea. That the ministry of this great future priest and king is going to happen in Zebulun. That the law of the Lord is going to come forth out of Mount Zion. And right now, we're several hundred miles away from that place if you're a Jew. So if we could kind of look from a 30,000-foot perspective on why are these books so important, is because for all of God's prophecy and God's plan to happen, we got to get these Jews back to Jerusalem. That is an extraordinarily significant piece of world history that we very easily overlook these books because it's kind of this weird story about people that we barely know that happened 500 years before Christ. But this repopulation of Israel is absolutely critical to the story of the Bible, because God has already prophesied that all of these significant events are going to happen in this dirt of Israel. And so that in my judgment, that's what makes these books significant. And further, it's why, if you go back and read in Isaiah and in Micah and even the books of the Kings and Chronicles, why did the common person, why did the priests of Israel and of Judah think that captivity was absolutely unthinkable? Why did they not even seem possible? Well, the reason is because God had promised that all these things were going to happen out of Israel. And so the idea that God was going to take his people out of Israel was unthinkable. It meant that God's word wasn't going to be able to be fulfilled. But God, in his long-term view and in his wisdom, the captivity was part of the plan. It wasn't removing the plan, it was part of the plan. And so part of that plan is bringing all of this nation back to Israel so that all these prophecies can be fulfilled. That, in my judgment, that is why these books are so significant. Also, I would say that just in human history, this concept of reforming a nation, like taking people who have been gone for 100 years and just bringing them back and reforming a nation, I challenge you to find anywhere in human history that's happened, except for here. It's just completely unheard of. That all of the leaders of a nation were taken into captivity, that their nation's capital was destroyed, that people were taken away with hooks in their jaws and drug away to a foreign kingdom, and then 100 years later they just let them go back and reform that same nation. It is completely, I just don't think there's anywhere else in human history that it's ever happened. The providence of God in this story, in getting the nation of Israel back to Jerusalem, this is an incredibly important story in the scheme of human redemption. The Savior was going to come from Israel, not just from the bloodline of Israel, but very clearly from the dirt of Israel. And for that to happen, we had to get the Jews back to Jerusalem. So that's why, in my judgment, these books are very, very important. Which leads us to question 2. So why are we going to tackle them in kind of this weird order that we're talking about this morning? And so if you will go back to the second page, or actually the first page of our material in the timeline, you'll note that the order that we're going to tackle these books, we're going to tackle a couple of chapters of Ezra, and then a couple of chapters, the book of Haggai, 2 chapters of Haggai. Going to jump into Zechariah, jump back into Ezra, jump into Zechariah, then jump into Esther, and then back to Ezra. We're going to jump around a little bit. The goal of that is to try to follow a certain chronology. But the chronology of Ezra and Nehemiah in this time period is debated. And so I want to spend just our remaining minutes this morning talking a little bit about the chronology of Ezra and Nehemiah. If you're into this kind of thing, you're going to love this. If you're not, just hang in there with me. It won't be like this the whole quarter, but just a few minutes on that chronology. I know that is impossible to see, but you have that exact same timeline on the second page of your material. I will note that I know the joker who did this material, and so if there are no question there's errors in it, you're going to find typos and errors, and there's probably errors with this timeline. This is one idiot's opinion. And so by all means, let's discuss if there are issues. But this timeline is the one, and it would be on top of your page, on the second page of your material. That timeline is the one that is most kind of commonly, this is conventional wisdom. If you look, if your Bible has the little preface to the books of the Bible that talk about when they were written and what the timeline is, this is kind of the conventional chronology. And we'll talk a little bit about why that always has created some issues. But that chronology is based on a list of Persian kings. These are names that we're going to be using the whole quarter. We might as well get to know them and love them. This is the list of Persian kings that are relevant to this time of Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah. And this is world history that is in very little debate. These kings happened in this order. And their times of their reigns are pretty well established. Like when they ruled, you can go to your favorite history site and you'll find these kings in this order with very little debate about what years they ruled. Cyrus, remember we start with him in Ezra chapter 1, verse 1, and the significance of him. Cambyses would be the next in line. There's a little bit of a fight for the throne after him, but then we get Darius the First or Darius the Great. Then we get Xerxes the First. Then we get Artaxerxes. The only thing that I will note here that you want to keep in mind is these are the Greek renderings of their names. They would have had different. The Hebrews would have spoken these differently, and in fact, that's very important because one of these Xerxes. The Hebrew rendering of his name is Ahasuerus. And again, that's pretty well established. That's the Hebrew rendering of that name. You'll see that name in the book of Esther, Ahasuerus. You'll also see that name in the book of Ezra, the name Ahasuerus. That's just the Hebrew equivalent to the name Xerxes. So, these kings are, again, that's world history, pretty well established. If you look at this timeline on the top of the page, kind of this conventional wisdom timeline, there are a few issues with it that kind of jump out right away. By the way, there are issues with my thought on the timeline too. There's issues either way you go. But here are some issues with this timeline, things that I'd probably never thought about until digging into the chronology of Ezra a little bit. The first thing is, in this generally accepted timeline, because of the way that Ezra puts forth the names of these Persian kings, and by the way, on your page and on the screen, the periods of time that are noted in the little bars are the periods of time that are covered by the books, not necessarily the life of the person. So when I say when the red bar on your page is Ezra, that isn't necessarily when Ezra lived. That's the time period covered in his book, if that makes sense. So the book of Ezra, according to the conventional timeline, has got this 60-year gap in the middle of it. It's between 2 chapters. You read so far along in the book of Ezra, and then the very next verse, it talks about a king that is 60 years in the future, and there's this 60-year gap we got no information about. It just kind of disappears, this 60-year gap. That has kind of confounded commentators for centuries. But the conventional wisdom is that's just the way it is. Zerubbabel and his part of the book of Ezra take us through 6 chapters, and then Ezra and his story takes over in chapter 7, and between the two there's this 60-year gap. It's kind of peculiar. Also would note, and you'll note this on your timeline, that there is a very significant gap between the completion of the temple, which we have a firm date for in the book of Ezra, and the completion of the wall of Nehemiah. That, again, the conventional timeline would have a 70-year gap between those two events, that the children of Israel rebuilt that temple as we read about in the book of Ezra, and then Nehemiah came and went about the rebuilding of the wall, and the conventional timeline would have a 70-year gap between those two events. Again, that may be legitimate. It's just strange to me that there would be this gap. I would also note that the temple was completed back here, but when Ezra came to teach people how to act in the temple, and that's essentially what Ezra did, starting in Ezra chapter 7, when Ezra came to do that, conventional timeline has a 60-year gap between when the temple was completed and Ezra coming to teach people how to act in the temple. Again, maybe perfectly legitimate, just seems peculiar. So those are some of the issues with the timeline. The reason we're going to tackle the class this quarter in the order that we are is because I'm going to tackle it with this proposed alternative timeline. Again, this is one idiot's opinion. I would say I'm not a lone idiot on this, that you can certainly find other scholars who do agree with this, but this would not be necessarily the conventional timeline. This one is kind of found in the middle of that page. And I'll talk first about why just chronologically it makes more sense to me, and then we'll get into some of the details of it. This kind of eliminates that gap in the book of Ezra, that it just kind of flows through. There's not this kind of random 60-year gap in the middle of the book of Ezra in this chronology. That the chronology in my judgment makes more sense, that the temple was completed, and then Ezra came to teach the people about the temple, and then the wall was completed, and the gap between the completion of the temple and the completion of the wall is down to 10 or 15 years. Again, that just makes more sense to me logically, chronologically, in those regards. The leap, how much time we got here? The leap that you have to take from a historical perspective to accept this kind of, and if you look up scholarship, it'll tell you a shortened timeline of Ezra, an abbreviated timeline of Ezra. The leap that you have to take, if you want to accept that, is you got to kind of just accept the possibility that the Bible writers referred to these names of these kings interchangeably. And that is a leap that many people aren't willing to make. And this is somewhat of a challenging concept. I'm going to try to tackle it and make sense of it. History will tell us there was truly a king named Darius. There was a king in history named Xerxes. There was a king named Artaxerxes. But remember, this is not what their mama called them. This is a throne name. Mama didn't give birth to baby and name him Xerxes. That Xerxes was a word that means warrior, and so when Persian leader took the throne, he took the throne name Xerxes. Same thing with Artaxerxes. Probably the same thing with Darius. That these are throne names. That's a concept that's not really familiar to us. It's certainly not familiar to me. That somebody would just assume a different name when they took the throne. The closest parallel that I can think of is Catholicism, that popes will often take a different name when they become pope. That they will assume a different name. That was not their name before they became a pope. Now, because this is just a throne name, there is some evidence that Bible writers were kind of fast and loose in the way they use these. That they might be referring to Darius, but they call him mighty warrior, which ends up being Xerxes, or Artaxerxes, or they call him warrior, which ends up being Xerxes. That is where this challenge comes in. Because modern historians, when they read the book of Ezra and they see Artaxerxes, they automatically put that out here in the reign of Artaxerxes. They say, well, Ezra said Artaxerxes, he clearly meant something that happened in 480 BC, 60 years later. The contention I would make this morning is that Ezra may have just been using that word to refer to him as a mighty warrior, but still talking about the same person. That is kind of a difficult mental leap, and I don't know how well I've done explaining that. The premise of the timeline that I'm going to talk about is that all of the, in my judgment, all of the events of Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi happened in the lifetime of one Persian ruler that history would know as Darius. That's going to be my contention. And that's the reason that we're tackling this class in the order that we are. That would mean that Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Daniel, Zerubbabel, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, they were all contemporaries and they likely all knew each other, which is kind of cool to think about. By the way, I should note, and I should have said this up front, whether you buy this or not, it really doesn't affect anything else that happens the rest of the quarter, because the lessons of Ezra are the lessons of Ezra no matter when it happened, and the lessons of Nehemiah are the lessons of Nehemiah no matter when it happened. I only touch on this in this first class to try to help explain why we're going to tackle these books in the order that we are. Because it is my contention that Esther happened under the same Persian king that sent Nehemiah back to Israel. That Esther happened under the same Persian king that Ezra went to. That Haggai was prophesying in the same time that Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther would have, again, they would have all been contemporaries. This would not be the most common timeline. It's not like completely unheard of. I didn't invent this. I'm not that smart. But this, again, in my judgment, this helps all the books make more sense. I know that was like drinking from a fire hose. I apologize. I would like to offer just a couple of places in Scripture where the conventional timeline is really, really difficult. And these are noted on the actual timeline page. Let's just take just a minute and look with me in the book of Ezra chapter 4. Ezra chapter 4, verses 4 through 6. And the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah. And we'll talk more about the specific context of this when we get to these chapters in our study. But the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah, made them afraid to build, and bribed counselors against them to frustrate the purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. And in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. And in the days of Artaxerxes, they wrote a letter written in Aramaic. And you continue the chapter. So there are 4 Persian rulers, different names that are used in that passage. Historians will say, well, we can easily identify who we're talking about because Ezra says that they were frustrated in the days of Cyrus and Darius and Ahasuerus and Artaxerxes, and those are all Persian kings, and so this book of Ezra must stretch across all of that time of history. To accept that Ezra is stretched like that makes these verses very confusing. Because Ezra is basically saying that the opponents frustrated the purpose in the days of Cyrus, in the days of Darius, in the days of Ahasuerus, and in the days of Artaxerxes. But then you go to the very next chapter, and it says that the temple was completed in the days of Darius. It just makes the timeline very, very disjointed. Now, there are ways around this. Historians have tried to make ways around this. But it just makes it very, very disjointed. Let's see. Go to chapter 6, and I know this isn't in our notes. We go to chapter 6, verse 13 and 14. So again, remember, Ezra just said that the opponents frustrated the plans of the Jews during Darius and during Ahasuerus and during Artaxerxes. And then according to the word sent by Darius, the king, Tatnai, the governor of the province beyond the river, Shethar-bozenai and the associates did with all diligence what Darius had ordered, and the elders of the Jews built and prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. They finished the building by decree of the God of Israel, by the decree of Cyrus and Darius, even Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And the house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year in the reign of Darius. So Ezra's pretty clear. I mean, that it appears that he's intentionally, with specificity, telling us when the temple was completed. The end of that verse, right? The 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of Darius the king. And yet he said a chapter and a half ago that their plans were frustrated during Darius and during Ahasuerus and during Artaxerxes. Again, that on the conventional understanding of the timeline, that just gets very disjointed. It gets very difficult. Again, there are ways around it, but you got to kind of assume that Ezra does a flash forward and then a flash back, and then it's not, again, lots of very smart people accept that, and he's talking about a flash forward to a future time, and then he comes back to present time. It's just, in my judgment, pretty complicated. It makes more sense to me, to say that in Ezra chapter 4, when he refers to the reign, I'm back in chapter 4 in verse 5, that when Ezra talks about the reign of Darius and the reign of Ahasuerus and the days of Artaxerxes, he is actually referring to the same person. He's calling them by a different name. Do we have example of the Bible writers being fast and loose with names like that? Actually, we do. We know that in the book of Daniel, I've got this reference on that page. If you're like really super geeky about this like I am, you might enjoy this. There are references in the book of Daniel where Cyrus's father was called Ahasuerus. History will tell you that was not his name. So either Daniel made a mistake, careful taking that leap, right? Either Daniel made a mistake, or Bible writers were just kind of loose with the way they referred to these kings, and they were referring to them as kind of their attributes rather than trying to refer to a specific person. There are other examples in the book of Ezra. If you go, when we just read this verse, Ezra chapter 6, in verse 14, the end of that verse, it says, they finished the building by decree of the God of Israel, by the decree of Cyrus. By the way, we can read that decree. We know what it says. And Darius, even Artaxerxes, king of Persia. Your version may say Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. Versions handle that different ways. Hebrew is very difficult to translate. If you've ever done any research into that, what does this specific little jot mean? Does it mean and, or does it mean even? It's very difficult to ascertain. There are some who would argue, and I would agree with them, that what Ezra is trying to say here is that by the decree of Cyrus and Darius called Artaxerxes king of Persia, or Darius, even Artaxerxes king of Persia, saying that Darius and Artaxerxes are synonymous, that we're talking about the same person. I know that's getting kind of deep in the weeds. The overarching point of all that is to say this abbreviated or shortened timeline of the book of Ezra that kind of eliminates that gap in Ezra, that eliminates that gap between the completion of the temple and the completion of the wall, that puts all of these Bible characters makes them kind of contemporaries. It makes most sense to me, and so that's how I want to present the material. It doesn't change the message of the book of Haggai. It doesn't change the message of the book of Ezra. After today, we may not even care. I only wanted to kind of lay this foundation this morning to make the point of why we're going to tackle these books in this order, and why I believe that Esther really does happen at the same time as the book of Ezra, and why I really do believe that Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel were contemporaries. And I would also say that there's one other passage I want to read. It's kind of just delicious, and you may have read this before. So Nehemiah chapter 2. This would be another argument for all of these names meaning the same thing. If you kind of go on the conventional timeline, the commonly kind of understood timeline, Esther exists here in the reign of Xerxes, and Ezra and Nehemiah are kind of on the other side of that, and none of the books mention each other at all. That Esther just kind of exists here, and there's no mention of Xerxes either in Ezra or Nehemiah. But if you look at Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 6, and again, you've probably seen this point made before, but it's very interesting in this context. Nehemiah says something very interesting when he goes to the king, and Nehemiah calls this king Artaxerxes. In Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 6, Nehemiah is going with his request for the king to allow him to go back to Jerusalem. And the king said to me, and then in parentheses in my version, with the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone until you return? There's no narrative reason for Nehemiah to say that the queen was sitting beside the king. There's no spiritual reason. There's no narrative reason. There's no cultural reason. There's really no logical reason that Nehemiah would have made that assertion that the queen was sitting beside him. But if you kind of accept this theory, it would have made a tremendous impact on the Jews for him to say that I went before the king, Darius, a.k.a. Ahasuerus, a.k.a. Artaxerxes, and his queen was sitting beside him. It would have been Esther. It would have been a story that the Jews knew tremendously well because of the Feast of Purim and all the things that happened because of the book of Esther, that when Nehemiah wrote that his queen was sitting beside him, it helps us kind of understand the mindset of the king and why he was so benevolent to the Jews. His wife was literally a Jewess. Again, that may be a leap, but I think it helps provide some context to that account. So I think that's interesting. The last thing that I'll say, and I know that we're almost out of time, and I knew that this class was going to be a lot less back and forth as we kind of set the groundwork. Future will be very different. We'll tackle Ezra chapter 1 and chapter 2 on Wednesday night, and we may make a passing reference to this timeline, but if you got more questions about it, in fact, I posted an article on the members section of the website with a lot more detail, if you are so inclined, about this dating and the shortened timeline of Ezra. The last point that I'll make is, if on this timeline, in my judgment, it is so impactful to think about that this return of the Israelites to Israel was so important to God, that this was so critical in the scheme of redemption, that this last Old Testament kind of burst of inspiration happens all in this, 40-year time window? That in this relatively abbreviated portion of time, we get all of these impactful Bible characters. We get Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther and Haggai and Zechariah, that all of these characters and all of this last inspiration of the Old Testament happens in this really abbreviated timeline. And then God is silent in terms of inspiration for 500 years. That he had completed the task of getting this nation back to Israel to prepare for the New Testament. And then he was silent for 500 years, which I think is kind of impactful. So thank you for suffering through that with me. Ezra chapter 1 and 2 on Wednesday, and thank you for being part of our class this quarter.